Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. The isolation was what I cherished most about my home in the Wari Mountains of North Carolina. I purchased the 15-acre property in early 2019 after years of saving, seeking respite from city life and its constant demands. The modest two-bedroom cabin sat nestled against a backdrop of dense pine forest that stretched for miles into the wilderness, offering panoramic views of mist-shrouded peaks from my back porch. By July 2020, I had established a small homestead. My mornings began at sunrise, tending to my small flock of chickens and 4 goats. Daisy, Willow, Jasper, and Scout. They weren't just livestock. They were companions in my solitude. The nearest neighbor, an elderly man named Joseph, lived 3 miles down the mountain road, and we exchanged pleasantries only when collecting mail from our roadside boxes. My daily routine was simple but fulfilling. I'd rise with the sun, feed the animals, work remotely on my laptop until mid-afternoon, then spend evenings gardening or hiking nearby trails. Weekends were for maintenance, mending fences, chopping firewood, or preserving vegetables from my garden. The rhythmic predictability brought comfort after years of chaotic urban schedules. The property included a large clearing where my cabin stood, surrounded by the animal enclosures. Beyond that, the land sloped downward toward a ravine approximately 200 yards behind the house. The ravine cut through my property like a scar, dropping nearly 30 feet at its deepest point, with a small stream running through it during rainy seasons. I rarely ventured there after discovering the difficult terrain and dense undergrowth made passage challenging. What I didn't know when purchasing the property, what the real estate agent conveniently omitted, was its proximity to an old Native American burial ground. I only discovered this through casual conversation with Joseph, who mentioned it existed somewhere within a mile or so of my cabin. I never gave it much thought. History is embedded in these mountains after all, and I respected the land's significance to those who came before me. My mother visited occasionally, concerned about my isolation. "It's not healthy," she'd say, arranging groceries in my refrigerator. "A person needs community." My father had offered similar warnings before his passing in 2018, cautioning me about the dangers of mountain living. I dismissed their concerns as parental overprotection. The mountains felt safer than any city I'd lived in. In those first 18 months, the only disturbances were occasional wildlife sightings, deer grazing at dawn, a black bear lumbering through my garden once, destroying a tomato plant before disappearing back into the forest. These encounters reminded me of my place in the natural order, a visitor in their domain. Until that night in July when everything changed. The day began unremarkably. The weather forecast predicted thunderstorms, and dark clouds had been gathering since early afternoon. By evening, a steady drizzle tapped against my metal roof, creating a soothing backdrop as I finished dinner. The temperature had dropped unusually, prompting me to light the wood stove despite it being midsummer. I remember checking my phone. No service, as was common during storms. The isolation rarely bothered me, but that evening a vague uneasiness settled over me as darkness fell. Perhaps it was the barometric pressure affecting my senses, or some primitive instinct responding to the atmospheric change. At approximately 10:15 p.m., the rain intensified. I was reading in my armchair when the first anomaly occurred. My internet connection dropped. Not unusual during storms, but this coincided with the electricity flickering 3 times before stabilizing. I marked my page and decided to ensure the generator was ready, should the power fail completely. Grabbing my raincoat and flashlight, I stepped onto the covered porch. The rain created a curtain around the property, visibility limited to perhaps 15 feet beyond the porch light's reach. I descended the steps, aiming my flashlight toward the small shed where the generator was housed. That's when I noticed the goats' behavior. Despite having a covered shelter in their enclosure, they were standing in the rain, clustered together facing the forest edge. Their bodies were rigid, alert in a way I'd never observed. Even through the rainfall, I could see them trembling. I diverted my path toward their enclosure, speaking softly to avoid startling them. None responded to my voice, unusual for animals that typically approach the fence when I called. As I drew closer, I heard their distressed bleating, a sound easily distinguishable from their normal vocalizations. "Hey there," I called, shining my light into their enclosure. "What's got you all worked up?" The beam caught their wide eyes, reflecting an unnatural brightness that unsettled me. They remained fixated on something beyond the fence line, toward the ravine area. I followed their gaze but saw only darkness and rain-blurred tree line. I counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, all present, but clearly disturbed. The chickens, too, were restless in their coop, clucking frantically instead of roosting quietly as they should have been at that hour. Something had frightened my animals. I approached the fence, peering into the darkness. The rational explanation was obvious. Predators often became bolder during storms when human activity decreased. Perhaps a coyote or even a mountain lion was prowling nearby. I needed to secure the livestock and check the perimeter. Returning to the house, I retrieved my rifle and a more powerful flashlight. The uneasy feeling had intensified, transforming from vague discomfort to focused alertness. I methodically checked the locks on the chicken coop before moving to the goat enclosure, securing the gate with an additional carabiner clip. The rain continued unabated as I began a perimeter check, starting at the northern edge of the property and working clockwise. The powerful beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing unusual along the western and southern boundaries. But as I approached the eastern edge, where my property met the ravine, the hairs on my neck stood on end. A faint odor reached me, something organic yet unfamiliar. Not the musty scent of wet soil or vegetation, but something sharper, almost metallic. I slowed my pace, sweeping the flashlight beam methodically along the tree line. Nothing moved except rain-heavy branches swaying in the wind. The goats' bleating suddenly intensified, drawing my attention back to their enclosure. They had moved, now pressing against the fence closest to me as though seeking protection. Their behavior contradicted everything I knew about goat psychology. They should have been in their shelter, not exposing themselves to the elements. I continued my inspection, reaching the point where my fence line approached the ravine's edge. The terrain dropped sharply here, creating a natural boundary that I'd reinforced with additional fencing to prevent the goats from attempting a dangerous descent. The smell was stronger now, accompanied by an odd sensation, the feeling of being watched. I swept my flashlight down into the ravine, the beam barely penetrating the dense vegetation and darkness. For a moment I thought I glimpsed movement, a shadow shifting against the backdrop of wet foliage. I froze, focusing intently on that spot. Nothing moved. After several moments, I convinced myself it was a trick of light and rain, my imagination heightened by the animal's unusual behavior. Still, I stood vigilant, counting seconds that stretched into minutes. The rain began to ease slightly, and in that brief reduction of ambient noise, I heard it, a sound so subtle it almost blended with the rainfall. A slow, deliberate rustling, too rhythmic to be wind-blown vegetation, too heavy to be a small animal. Something was moving down in the ravine. The distinctive crack of a branch breaking echoed from the ravine, unmistakable even through the rainfall. I instinctively raised my rifle, pointing the barrel alongside my flashlight beam. Heart pounding in my ears, I took 3 careful steps closer to the edge, aware of the slick ground beneath my boots. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. If this was a person, they were trespassing deep on private property in miserable conditions. If it was an animal, I'd just announced my presence unnecessarily. No response came except the continued sound of movement, more deliberate now, as though whatever was down there had paused at my voice and then resumed with purpose. I swept the light methodically from left to right, trying to penetrate the thick undergrowth. The beam caught something approximately 20 yards down the slope. A brief reflection, like light bouncing off wet glass. Except it blinked, twice. Eyes. I steadied the beam on that spot, but whatever had reflected my light had shifted position. The movement was swift, controlled, and disturbingly deliberate. Not the panicked flight of startled wildlife. "Identify yourself," I called, attempting authority despite the tremor in my voice. "This is private property." What happened next remains burned in my memory with terrifying clarity. The rustling accelerated, moving not away from me but parallel to the ravine's edge, as though the intruder was positioning itself. I tracked the sound with my light, and approximately 30 yards to my right, something began to ascend the ravine wall. I caught only glimpses, fingers or what appeared to be hands gripping exposed tree roots, pulling upward with unnatural strength. The movement was spider-like, using multiple points of contact to navigate the steep incline with disturbing efficiency. Training my light directly on the climbing figure, I finally saw it clearly, and my mind recoiled from what my eyes registered. The figure had humanoid proportions but moved with a fluidity no human could achieve. Its skin, if it could be called that, had a grayish-blue coloration that appeared almost wet in the flashlight beam, reminiscent of ash mixed with clay. Most disturbing was its face, nearly featureless from my distance, with deep-set eyes that reflected my light with an opalescent quality. It paused its ascent, clinging to the ravine wall approximately 15 feet below my position. We locked eyes, a moment of mutual assessment that lasted perhaps 3 seconds but felt eternal. Its eyes were the same ashen blue as its skin, lacking discernible pupils or whites. Not animal eyes, not human eyes either. My training took over, and I disengaged the safety on my rifle, bringing it firmly against my shoulder. The metallic click seemed to trigger a response in the creature. It opened what I can only describe as a mouth, though it appeared to lack defined lips, and released a sound that still haunts my dreams. The scream started as something approximating a human woman's cry, but it distorted halfway through, modulating into frequencies that felt physically painful to hear. Not just loud, but somehow wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The sound contained multitudes, pain, rage, and something that registered as mockery. As it screamed, it pulled itself higher on the ravine wall, now only about 10 feet below my position. In the direct beam of my flashlight, I could see what I had initially mistaken for hands were elongated digits ending in tapered points. Not quite claws, not quite fingers, but something horrifyingly between. I aimed the rifle at the center of its mass and fired a warning shot just above its head. The gunshot seemed to confuse rather than frighten it. The creature paused, tilting its head at an angle that exceeded normal human range of motion. Then it rose to its full height, bracing against the steep incline with impossible balance. 7, perhaps 8 feet tall. Its proportions were wrong. Limbs too long, torso too narrow, joints articulating in ways that human anatomy couldn't permit. It regarded me for another moment before turning away with unnatural quickness. Before disappearing back into the ravine, it looked over its shoulder, a final assessment that felt deliberate and intelligent. Then it moved with such sudden acceleration that my eye could barely track the motion. One moment it stood on the ravine wall, the next it had vanished into the darkness below. I remained frozen, rifle still aimed at the spot where it had been for what must have been several minutes. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, and in the new quiet I could hear my own ragged breathing. When I finally lowered the rifle, my arms were trembling uncontrollably. I backed away from the ravine edge, unwilling to turn my back to it, until I reached a safe distance. Then I ran, a full sprint back to my cabin, nearly falling twice on the slick ground. I burst through my door, locked it behind me, and collapsed against it. The rational part of my brain searched desperately for explanations. A bear with mange, a homeless person with deformities. A hallucination triggered by isolation and storm conditions. None fit what I had seen. I spent that night with every light in the cabin illuminated, rifle across my lap, watching the windows and doors. The animals remained agitated until dawn, their distress a confirmation that something real had invaded our sanctuary. Morning brought no clarity, only questions multiplying like bacteria in a petri dish. I hadn't slept, my body rigid with vigilance throughout the night. As dawn's gray light filtered through my windows, I performed a cautious patrol of my property, rifle slung over my shoulder. The physical evidence was minimal, but undeniable. Near the ravine's edge where I'd encountered the figure, I found disturbed soil and vegetation, clear indications that something had climbed the steep incline. More troubling were the partial impressions in the mud, not definitive footprints, but elongated depressions suggesting weight distribution unlike any animal I recognized. The goats remained clustered in the center of their enclosure, refusing to approach the eastern fence line nearest the ravine. Their food lay untouched despite my attempts to coax them with fresh hay and apple slices. The chickens similarly stayed huddled in their coop, reluctant to venture into their run despite the door standing open. Animals know. They sense threats beyond human perception. Their continued distress confirmed I hadn't imagined the previous night's events. I needed to tell someone. My mother would assume mental deterioration from isolation. Local authorities would dismiss it as wildlife or file a perfunctory report that led nowhere. Joseph, my elderly neighbor, seemed the only reasonable option. I drove the 3 miles to his property, rehearsing explanations that wouldn't sound deranged. Joseph was working in his garden when I arrived, his weathered hands methodically weeding between rows of corn. He straightened when he saw me, concern immediately visible on his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Neighbor," he said, wiping soil from his palms. "Something like that," I replied, accepting his invitation inside for coffee. His kitchen was warm, cluttered with decades of accumulated life, photographs of children and grandchildren, cookbooks with dog-eared pages. The normalcy was comforting after my night of terror. I explained what had happened, starting with the animal's behavior and ending with my encounter at the ravine. I omitted nothing, despite knowing how it must sound. Joseph listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When I finished, he remained silent for several moments, staring into his coffee cup as though divining answers from its depths. "What do you know about the history of that land?" he finally asked. "Only what the real estate agent told me. It was logging property until the 1970s, then sat unused until I purchased it." Joseph nodded slowly. "That's the commercial history. There's older history." He rose from the table, disappearing into another room before returning with a leather-bound book, a county history, self-published by a local historical society in the 1980s. He opened to a page marked with a faded receipt and pushed it toward me. The chapter detailed local Native American territories before European settlement. The Wari Mountains, named after a subgroup of the Cherokee who had inhabited the region, contained several sites considered sacred, including burial grounds. "The ravine on your property," Joseph said, tapping the page, "sits at the edge of what was once considered hallowed ground. The tribe buried their dead there for generations before being forcibly relocated." I frowned. "Are you suggesting I saw a ghost? A spirit?" "I'm not suggesting anything," he replied, closing the book. "Just providing context. These mountains have memories longer than any of us. But there's something else, something not in that book." He told me about incidents over decades, livestock mutilations, unexplained disappearances of hikers, maintenance workers refusing to service properties near certain areas. All stories dismissed as mountain superstition or attributed to natural predators. "William Jenkins owned your property before it was subdivided for sale," Joseph continued. "Kept to himself mostly. One winter, maybe 1983, he came to town raving about something stalking his property. Nobody believed him. William had a reputation for drinking. 3 weeks later, a hunter found him dead in those woods. Official cause was exposure, but there were rumors about the condition of the body." "What kind of rumors?" I asked, stomach tightening. "The kind people don't discuss openly," Joseph replied. "Just that it wasn't exposure that killed him, and that whoever found him wouldn't talk about what they saw." I left Joseph's house with more questions than answers. He'd shared the information not to frighten me, but as a warning. These mountains contained secrets, and perhaps I had glimpsed one. On the drive home, I noticed dark clouds gathering again. Another storm approaching. The thought of spending another night alone with rain drumming on my roof, masking other sounds, was unbearable. I needed evidence, validation, something concrete to prove what I'd seen was real. Back at my property, I installed the trail cameras I'd purchased months earlier to track wildlife but never deployed. 4 cameras strategically positioned, one facing the goat enclosure, one covering the approach from the woods, and 2 aimed at different sections of the ravine edge. I reinforced doors and windows, moved my mattress to the living room away from ground-level windows, and prepared for nightfall. The storm arrived just before sunset, heavy clouds transforming dusk to darkness prematurely. As I checked the rifle for the dozenth time, A realization formed. Whatever I'd encountered wasn't leaving. This wasn't a chance meeting with a passing entity. Something about my property, about me, had attracted its attention. The waiting began. 3 nights passed without incident. The animals gradually returned to normal behavior, though they still avoided the eastern fence line near the ravine. I checked the trail cameras daily, finding nothing beyond ordinary wildlife. Deer, raccoons, a fox slinking along the property edge. I began to question my experience. Perhaps stress and isolation had distorted my perception of a bear or other natural predator. Joseph's stories had merely fed into a temporary paranoia. The rational explanations I'd initially dismissed now seemed increasingly plausible. On the 4th night, I slept in my bedroom for the first time since the encounter. The restored normalcy felt like victory over irrational fear. Until 3:17 a.m., when I woke to the sound of scratching at my bedroom window. Not the random scratching of tree branches in wind. This was rhythmic, deliberate. 3 scratches, pause. 3 scratches, pause. My blood seemed to congeal in my veins as I lay motionless, eyes fixed on the window covered by blinds I'd thankfully closed before sleeping. The scratching continued for approximately 2 minutes before stopping abruptly. I remained paralyzed, straining to hear any movement outside. Nothing. Eventually, I gathered enough courage to reach for the flashlight on my nightstand. But I couldn't bring myself to approach the window or open the blinds. I spent the remainder of the night in the hallway, away from any windows, rifle across my knees. Morning revealed 3 distinct parallel marks on my bedroom windowsill, not deep gouges, but perfect vertical lines in the wood, spaced approximately 2 inches apart, as though drawn with precision tools, too perfect for animal claws, too deliberate for accidental damage. I photographed them with trembling hands, then checked the trail cameras with renewed urgency. The first 3 showed nothing unusual, but the 4th, positioned facing the ravine, had captured something at 3:09 a.m., minutes before the scratching began. The infrared image was grainy, the figure partially obscured by foliage, but undeniably present, a tall bipedal form at the ravine edge. Its proportions distorted in that same wrongness I'd witnessed. The camera had captured it looking directly at the lens, those reflective eyes creating 2 perfect orbs of light in the darkness. The timestamp on the next image read 3:10 a.m. The frame was empty. Whatever it was had moved faster than the camera's motion sensor could track. This was evidence, confirmation I wasn't losing my mind. Yet having proof brought no comfort, only escalating fear. The creature had approached my house, had specifically targeted my bedroom window. The randomness of our first encounter was replaced by apparent intent. I drove to town immediately, checking into a small motel on the outskirts. I needed distance, perspective, and most importantly, witnesses, other humans whose presence might dilute whatever focused attention had settled on me. For 2 days, I remained in town researching obsessively on my laptop. I discovered others had reported similar encounters throughout the Appalachian region, descriptions that matched what I'd seen, though often dismissed as modern folklore or hoaxes. One account particularly resonated, a Forest Service worker in Tennessee who described an entity with skin like wet ash that moved with impossible speed through the trees. The worker had found similar scratches on his truck and cabin windows before relocating. His report included a detail that sent ice through my veins. The entity seemed most active during storms, using rainfall to mask its movements. The weather forecast showed thunderstorms approaching the mountains that night. I faced a decision: abandon my property or return and confront whatever was happening. Financial reality made the choice for me. I couldn't afford to lose my investment or start over elsewhere. My home was all I had. That evening, I returned to my property with new supplies, additional motion-activated lights, a digital voice recorder, and a thermal imaging attachment for my phone. Expensive but necessary if I wanted documented evidence. The goats' reaction to my return was troubling. Rather than their usual greeting, they backed away, watching me with the same wariness they'd shown toward the ravine. The chickens, too, scattered when I approached their coop. My animals no longer recognized me, or sensed something had changed about me. A scent, perhaps. Had proximity to the entity somehow marked me? I installed the new lights, positioning them to eliminate shadows around the cabin's perimeter. As dusk approached, I checked and rechecked doors and windows. The storm arrived as predicted, wind driving rain against the cabin in sheets. At 11:42 p.m., all motion lights activated simultaneously. Power fluctuated, lights dimming before stabilizing. I positioned myself away from windows, monitoring the property through gaps in the blinds. Thermal attachment ready. Movement registered at the property edge. Heat signature indicating a large mass approaching from the ravine direction. The thermal image showed a bipedal form, but its heat pattern was wrong. Cooler than the surrounding air rather than warmer, creating a negative impression against the rain-soaked landscape. It moved with that same unsettling fluidity toward the goat enclosure, pausing at the fence line. The animals pressed against the opposite side as far from the figure as possible. For several minutes it simply stood there, as though studying their reactions. Then it turned toward my cabin. The direct intentionality of its movement eliminated any doubt about random animal behavior. This was purposeful. It approached the eastern wall of my cabin, moving between motion lights with precision that suggested awareness of their coverage areas. I activated the voice recorder as it reached the exterior wall adjacent to my living room. For several moments, silence except for rainfall and my controlled breathing. Then it began, a soft rhythmic tapping on the wall. Not random or accidental, the pattern repeated exactly. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 3 taps. A communication attempt? A form of psychological torment? I couldn't determine the intent, but the deliberate patterning indicated intelligence. The tapping continued for approximately 4 minutes before stopping. Through the thermal attachment, I watched the figure retreat to the property edge, then stand motionless facing my cabin, watching, waiting. For what? I couldn't fathom. But the scratching, the tapping, these were escalations from observation to interaction. And the pattern was clear. Each encounter brought it closer, each action more direct. It was testing boundaries, learning my responses, adapting. And I was running out of options. The following morning, I drove to Joseph's house with my evidence, the photographs, thermal images, and audio recording. He examined everything silently, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "You should leave," he said finally, returning my phone. "At least temporarily. And go where? This is everything I have." Joseph sighed, rubbing his weathered face. "There's someone you should talk to." Retired professor who studied local folklore. Name's Robert Wilson. Lives about 40 minutes north in Beechwood. He wrote down an address and phone number. "Call first. Tell him I sent you. And tell him exactly what you've experienced. Don't minimize anything." Professor Wilson agreed to meet that afternoon. His home was modest but surrounded by an impressive library that had clearly outgrown its designated space. Books stacked on every surface, filing cabinets lining hallways. Wilson was in his 70s, thin and stooped with age, but his eyes remained sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. He examined my evidence with methodical thoroughness, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound journal. "What you're describing," he said finally, "aligns with regional accounts dating back to early settlement. The Cherokee had specific prohibitions against entering certain forest areas, particularly ravines and caves. They described entities they called the Hollow Ones, beings that existed between worlds, capable of mimicking human form but fundamentally empty inside." He selected a book from a nearby shelf, opening to a page containing primitive artwork, a tall, elongated figure with featureless face and extended limbs. This image was documented in 1838 by a missionary working with the Cherokee before the forced relocation. The tribe attributed disappearances and livestock deaths to these entities. The missionary dismissed it as superstition until experiencing something himself, an encounter he described as a figure of ash and mist that approached his cabin during rainfall. Wilson closed the book carefully. Contemporary accounts share consistent elements. The entities appear most active during storms, demonstrate interest in human habitation, and show signs of intelligence including mimicry and pattern recognition. "What do they want?" I asked, the question that had haunted me since the first encounter. Wilson's expression darkened. According to traditional beliefs, they seek to understand humans through observation and eventual occupation. Occupation? The Cherokee believed these entities lacked something essential, a soul, spirit, whatever terminology you prefer. They observe humans to learn imitation, but ultimately seek to inhabit human spaces, human communities, potentially human bodies. Hence the name Hollow Ones, empty vessels seeking to be filled with borrowed humanity. The implication sent cold waves through my body. Are you suggesting this thing wants to replace me? I'm sharing documented folklore, Wilson cautioned. I make no claims about reality versus mythology, but the consistency of accounts across centuries suggests something tangible underlies these stories. He continued, explaining that reported encounters typically progress through stages: observation from distance, approach during vulnerable periods, attempted communication through mimicry, and finally, direct interaction. The final stage, Wilson said carefully, involves invitation. According to the Cherokee, these entities cannot cross thresholds or fully interact with humans without some form of consent or invitation. I've never invited it, I insisted. Invitation can be subtle, responding to mimicry, acknowledging its presence, even speaking its name if you knew it. Wilson leaned forward. What's critical is understanding you're already in the later stages of this progression. If the folklore holds any truth, your situation is precarious. He recommended protective measures, traditional methods including salt barriers at thresholds, maintaining constant light, and specific verbal rejections if direct contact occurred. More practical advice included installing security cameras with continuous recording and never remaining alone on the property. As I prepared to leave, Wilson placed a hand on my arm. There's something else you should know. The burial ground near your property, do you know its significance? I shook my head. According to records, it wasn't just any burial ground. It contained specialized interments, individuals the tribe considered touched by outside forces, shamans who'd communed too deeply with other realms, individuals who'd exhibited unusual behaviors after certain forest encounters. The implication hung between us, unspoken but clear. My property bordered a containment site for those who'd experienced exactly what was happening to me. As I drove home through gathering darkness, Wilson's parting words echoed. Whatever you do, don't engage it in conversation. Don't respond to mimicry. And most importantly, don't invite it inside, no matter what form the invitation might take. I returned to my property at dusk, the horizon bruised with another approaching storm. Following Wilson's advice, I lined doorways and windowsills with salt, feeling simultaneously foolish and desperate. I positioned new security cameras, continuous feed rather than motion-activated, and prepared for another night of vigilance. The storm arrived with unusual ferocity around 9 p.m., wind howling through the surrounding forest and driving rain horizontally against the cabin. Twice the power flickered but held. The animals remained unusually quiet despite the weather, their silence more unsettling than distress would have been. At 11:17 p.m., the security camera covering the ravine edge registered movement. The figure emerged from below, its form more visible than previous encounters, perhaps due to the continuous recording, capturing its fluid movement in full. It ascended the ravine wall with that same unsettling efficiency, reaching the property edge within seconds. This time, it didn't approach the animal enclosures or circle the property. It moved directly toward the cabin with purposeful strides, its gait unnaturally smooth despite the rain-slicked terrain. The exterior lights illuminated it clearly for the first time. That ashen blue-gray skin, the elongated proportions, the face with features that seemed unfinished rather than absent. It stopped approximately 20 feet from my front porch, standing motionless in the downpour. Not hiding, not attempting stealth, deliberately visible, deliberately present. For 43 minutes, I checked the timestamp on the security feed. It remained in that exact position, rain streaming over its form without apparent effect, watching, waiting. Then it spoke. The sound came through clearly on the security system's audio. My name, pronounced with perfect inflection but wrong resonance, as though spoken through water or dense fabric. I froze, Wilson's warning echoing, "Don't engage it in conversation." Don't respond to mimicry. It repeated my name, then added words that stopped my breath. I know you're afraid. The voice was changing, modulating with each word, becoming more natural, more human, mimicking speech patterns it must have heard from me during previous observations. I'm not what you think, it continued, its articulation improving with each syllable. I've been watching you, learning from you. I mean no harm. The last sentence was delivered in a perfect replication of my own voice, a recording of words I'd spoken on the phone to my mother weeks earlier. It took another step toward the porch. Let me explain. Let me in and I'll explain everything. The invitation was exactly as Wilson had warned. It needed me to permit entry. Despite my terror, I found perverse reassurance in this confirmation of Wilson's research. If the prohibition against uninvited entry was real, I retained some control over the situation. You don't belong here, I called through the door, immediately regretting breaking my silence. Leave my property. Its response was immediate, a smile that stretched too wide across its face, revealing teeth that appeared more numerous than human dentition should allow. Your property? It replied, my voice distorting as it spoke. This was never your property. You are the visitor here, the temporary occupant. It took another step forward, now at the bottom of my porch steps. I've existed here for centuries, watching your kind come and go. So fragile, so brief. Rain continued pouring over its form, but I noticed now that it left no impression. Water seemed to pass through rather than around it, as though its physical presence was somehow incomplete. What do you want? I asked, unable to contain the question despite knowing engagement was dangerous. Understanding, it replied. Completion. It raised a hand toward the door. We are not so different, you and I, both alone, both seeking connection. Its manipulation was transparent yet effective, targeting my known isolation, my vulnerability. I felt a dangerous curiosity beneath my fear, questions forming. What was it? Where had it come from? What could it tell me about this land? About history beyond human record? The rational part of my brain recognized the trap. This was precisely how folklore described these entities operating, creating false kinship, exploiting human curiosity and loneliness to gain invitation. I reject you, I stated firmly, using the specific phrasing Wilson had suggested. You are not welcome here. I revoke any invitation you believe you have. Something changed in its expression, a flicker of what might have been anger or frustration distorting its features momentarily before returning to that too wide smile. You invited me the moment you built your home at the edge of my domain, it said. The moment you looked into the ravine with curiosity rather than fear. The moment you fired your weapon, acknowledgement is invitation enough. It placed one foot on the bottom porch step. The security camera showed the salt line I'd placed beginning to darken, as though absorbing moisture from the air despite being protected from direct rainfall. Last chance, it said, voice modulating between mimicry of mine and something older, deeper. Willing acceptance brings understanding. Resistance brings something less pleasant. I remained silent, watching through the security monitor as it took another step upward. The salt line blackened further but remained intact. Its expression shifted again, the approximation of humanity draining away, revealing something ancient and cold beneath the surface. With unnatural speed, it suddenly pressed against the door, face inches from the security camera. You will let me in eventually, it said, voice no longer attempting human inflection. Your kind always does. Curiosity, loneliness, desperation, all paths lead to invitation. It remained pressed against the door for several heartbeats before withdrawing suddenly. On the security feed, I watched it retreat to the property edge with that same fluid movement, pausing once to look back at the cabin. Then it descended into the ravine, disappearing from camera view. I didn't sleep that night or the following day. The encounter had escalated beyond anything I'd anticipated. Direct communication, sophisticated psychological manipulation, explicit threat. The entity wasn't merely observing anymore. It was actively seeking entry, actively targeting me. And it was patient, far more patient than any human could be. 3 days passed without further incident. The continuous security monitoring showed nothing unusual, and gradually the animals returned to normal behavior. Even the goats ventured near the eastern fence line again, suggesting whatever presence they'd sensed had withdrawn. I maintained vigilance but began to hope the entity had abandoned its efforts, perhaps deterred by my explicit rejection. Sleep returned in brief increments, though never deeply enough to feel rested. On the fourth night, I woke suddenly at 2:14 a.m., not from noise, but from its absence. The usual forest sounds had stopped completely. The silence was absolute, creating pressure against my eardrums like high altitude. Checking the security feed showed nothing unusual outside. The property remained empty, the ravine edge undisturbed. Yet the unnatural silence persisted, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Then I noticed something on the interior camera feed, a shadow where no shadow should be, moving across my kitchen wall. Not cast from outside, but manifesting within the house itself. Ice formed in my chest as I realized the implications. The entity hadn't withdrawn, it had changed tactics. I reached for my rifle only to find it missing from its position beside my bed. Heart hammering, I moved silently to my bedroom door, peering through the crack into the hallway. The security feed on my phone showed nothing in the corridor, yet the house felt occupied in a way that transcended physical presence. A soft rustling sound came from the kitchen. Not footsteps, but something dragging across countertops. I had two options: remain hidden or confront whatever had breached my sanctuary. Survival instinct suggested the former, but deeper understanding prevailed. Hiding would only prolong inevitability. If the entity had found a way inside, retreat offered no real safety. I moved silently down the hallway, phone clutched in trembling fingers, recording everything. The kitchen doorway gaped ahead, darkness beyond, broken only by the dim light of appliance displays. As I approached, a shape resolved within the darkness, not fully corporeal, but denser than shadow. It moved with familiar fluidity, examining my living space with methodical curiosity. "How did you get in?" I asked, voice barely above whisper. It turned toward me, form solidifying as it moved into the dim light. More defined than before, yet still wrong. Proportions exaggerated, features approximated rather than authentic. "You invited me," it replied, voice hollow yet precise. "Not with words. With thought. With curiosity. With attention." It gestured toward my research notes spread across the dining table. Wilson's information, my own observations, printouts of similar encounters from online sources. "To name something is to summon it," it continued. "To study something is to welcome it. Your mind opened the door your body kept closed." Understanding dawned with horrifying clarity. My obsessive research, my constant thoughts about the entity. Wilson had warned that invitation could take subtle forms. My focused attention had created a connection that transcended physical barriers. "Then I withdraw that invitation," I stated firmly. "I reject your presence in my home, in my thoughts." It made a sound, not quite laughter, not quite sigh. Too late for that. Once granted, access cannot be revoked so easily. It moved closer, its form becoming more substantial with proximity. "But I haven't come to harm. I've come to offer exchange. Knowledge for knowledge, experience for experience." "What knowledge could you possibly want from me?" I asked, buying time as I edged toward the kitchen drawer containing a backup weapon. "How it feels," it replied simply. "Embodiment, limitation, mortality, the intensity that comes with brevity." It tilted its head, studying me. "Your kind experiences everything so vividly because your time is so constrained. I want to understand that. And what do I get in exchange?" My fingers closed around the drawer handle. Truth, age, memory beyond human record. It extended a hand, more defined now, fingers elongated but recognizably hand-shaped. "Touch and know what existed before your kind named these mountains." The offer was seductive precisely because it targeted my intellectual curiosity, the same trait that had brought me to this isolated property, seeking understanding of a simpler life. The same trait that had compelled me to investigate rather than flee after our first encounter. My fingers tightened on the drawer handle, but I didn't pull it open. Something fundamental had shifted in my understanding. This confrontation couldn't be resolved with weapons or physical resistance. The entity had breached thresholds more significant than doors or windows. It had entered the realm of thought, of attention. "No," I said finally, straightening my posture. "I reject your offer. I withdraw my attention. I revoke the invitation of my curiosity." For the first time, uncertainty crossed its features, a ripple of something like confusion or concern. "You cannot simply—" "I can," I interrupted. "My attention is mine to give or withhold. My thoughts are under my control." With each statement, I focused on emptying my mind of curiosity about the entity, replacing fascination with deliberate disinterest. It moved closer, form fluctuating between solidity and shadow. "You've seen me. You cannot unsee." "I can choose what holds significance in my perception," I countered, "and I choose to find you insignificant." The effect was immediate and startling. Its form wavered, edges becoming less defined. The more I focused on genuine disinterest rather than fear or curiosity, the less substantial it appeared. Understanding bloomed. Attention was its sustenance, curiosity its invitation, fear its foothold. By withdrawing these, I was effectively closing the door I had unknowingly opened. "This changes nothing," it said, voice less resonant now. "I remain, I wait. Curiosity always returns." "Perhaps," I acknowledged, "but not tonight, and not here." I turned my back on it, the most profound rejection possible, and walked deliberately from the kitchen. Behind me I heard a sound like wind through dry leaves, then silence returned. The security feed showed nothing in the kitchen, nothing on the property. The forest sounds gradually resumed outside, crickets first, then the distant call of a night bird. By morning I had made my decision. The property would be sold. Not out of fear, but out of respect for boundaries older than human settlement. Some places exist at intersections between worlds, and this land clearly marked such a threshold. I didn't belong there, not because something else claimed it, but because proper stewardship required acknowledgement of history beyond deed records and property lines. Joseph helped me find a buyer, a developer planning to build vacation homes. I didn't warn them about what existed in the ravine. Perhaps I should have, but some knowledge must be earned through experience rather than transmitted through words. I relocated to coastal North Carolina, far from mountains and ravines. The encounters faded from immediate concern to occasional memory, though certain sounds still trigger vigilance. Rainfall on metal roofing, branches scratching windows during storms. Sometimes, in dreams, I hear my name spoken in that hollow voice, feel attention focused on me from somewhere distant yet connected. On those nights, I practiced the same disciplined disinterest that proved effective in our final confrontation. I don't know if the entity was supernatural, interdimensional, or simply an undocumented species with intelligence and abilities beyond current scientific understanding. Classification matters less than respect for boundaries, those we can see and those we can only sense. What remains certain is that some places in this world stand at intersections between known and unknown. Some boundaries exist for reasons lost to human memory but preserved in older awareness. And sometimes, the most effective resolution isn't confrontation but withdrawal, not from fear, but from recognition that not all mysteries require solving. Not all knowledge benefits from human attention. The mountains keep their secrets, and I have learned to stop asking questions whose answers might come at too high a price. The summer of 2019 was supposed to be like any other. Instead, it became the season that would haunt my dreams for years to come. I was 15 when my parents decided I would benefit from a return to Whispering Pines Equestrian Camp, a place I had visited for the past 4 summers. Their reasoning was simple. I needed structure and fresh air, not endless days playing video games in our basement. "You'll thank us later," Mom said as she packed my duffel bag, stuffing in the worn riding boots I'd outgrown emotionally if not physically. "Besides, you've always loved Whispering Pines." She wasn't wrong. I had loved it, past tense. But something about returning that year felt different. A reluctance I couldn't articulate settled into my bones as we drove down the winding road toward the camp entrance. The tall pines that gave the place its name seemed to bend toward our car, their shadows longer and darker than I remembered. Whispering Pines sat nestled in a valley, Surrounded by dense forest and rolling hills about 3 hours from the nearest major city, the main lodge was a sprawling timber structure built in the 1950s, with smaller cabins scattered throughout the property. The horse stables were my favorite part: clean, well-maintained barns that housed 30 horses of various breeds and temperaments. As our car pulled through the wooden archway marking the entrance, I noticed the camp sign had weathered considerably since last summer. The once bright paint was peeling, and one of the carved pine trees had split down the middle. "Looks like they need to do some maintenance," Dad commented, eyeing the sign. The camp director, Mrs. Winters, greeted us with the same enthusiastic wave she'd given for years. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and despite her 60-something years, she moved with the energy of someone half her age. "Welcome back," she called, clipboard in hand. "We've got you in Pinecrest Cabin this year. You're one of our senior campers now, so you'll be helping with the younger ones occasionally." I nodded, trying to match her enthusiasm and failing miserably. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, despite the clear blue sky overhead. As my parents drove away, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing except the gentle sway of pine needles in the afternoon breeze. Pinecrest Cabin was one of the older structures, positioned at the edge of the clearing, closer to the forest than I would have preferred. The wooden walls had darkened with age, and the roof was partially covered with a blue tarp, where leaks had been hastily repaired. Inside, the floorboards creaked with every step, and the scent of mildew hung in the air despite the open windows. 3 cots lined each wall, though only 4 would be occupied according to the roster taped to the door. I claimed the bed farthest from the entrance, setting my duffel on the worn mattress. Within the hour, my cabin mates arrived. 2 younger girls, Bonnie and Cassidy, both around 11, claimed beds opposite mine, chattering excitedly about which horses they hoped to ride. The 4th camper was a quiet girl named Rita, closer to my age, who offered a small wave before settling onto the remaining bed. "Have you been here before?" Rita asked, carefully arranging her belongings in the small trunk beside her cot. "4 years," I replied. "You?" "First time." She glanced toward the window, her expression unreadable. My parents thought it would be good for my anxiety. Being around animals, nature, all that. Something in her tone made me pause. "You don't seem convinced," Rita shrugged. "I don't know. Something feels off about this place. Maybe it's just me." I wanted to tell her I felt it too, that strange sensation of wrongness that had settled over me the moment we'd arrived. But instead, I just nodded and continued unpacking. No point in scaring her on the first day. That night, during the welcome campfire, I found myself studying the other campers and counselors. There were about 50 of us in total, mostly girls between 10 and 16, with a handful of male campers among the older groups. The counselors were college-aged, enthusiastic but clearly tired from preparation week. As Mrs. Winters went through the camp rules and schedule, I felt my attention drifting toward the darkness beyond our circle of light. The fire cast long shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources, stretching toward the woods like grasping fingers. For a moment, just a brief, terrifying moment, I thought I saw something move between the trees, a figure unnaturally tall and thin weaving between the pines. I blinked and it was gone, leaving me to wonder if it had been there at all. Morning brought temporary relief from the uneasiness that had plagued me since arrival. Sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, casting warm patterns across the wooden floor. I had slept fitfully, waking several times to unfamiliar sounds, the rustling of leaves, distant snaps of twigs, and once what sounded like scratching along the cabin wall. Breakfast was served in the main lodge, a chaotic affair of pancakes and excited chatter as campers discussed their activity preferences. I picked at my food, unable to shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach overnight. "You're assigned to Snowfall," Mrs. Winters informed me as she handed out the horse assignments. "She's new this year, but the staff thinks she'll be a good match for your experience level." I felt a twinge of disappointment. I'd hoped to be paired with Misty, the dapple gray mare I'd ridden the previous summer. "What happened to Misty?" Mrs. Winters' smile faltered slightly. "She became difficult to handle this spring. We relocated her to a therapy program more suited to her needs." Something about her hesitation made me wonder if there was more to the story. but I didn't press further. The stables were a 10-minute walk from the main camp area, a sprawling wooden structure with 2 long rows of stalls. The familiar sense of hay, leather, and horses greeted me as I entered, bringing a momentary comfort that quickly dissipated when I reached Snowfall's stall. The white Arabian mare was beautiful, with delicate features and alert eyes. But unlike the other horses who were calmly eating or dozing in their stalls, Snowfall stood rigidly in the center of her space, ears pricked forward, muscles tensed as if ready to bolt. "She's still adjusting," explained Reggie, the head wrangler, a man in his early 30s with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands. "Gentle introduction is key. Just spend today getting to know each other." I nodded, carefully entering the stall with a curry comb in hand. Snowfall's eyes tracked my every movement, her nostrils flaring as she assessed me. "Hey there, beautiful," I murmured, extending my hand slowly. "We're going to be friends, okay?" After several minutes, Snowfall allowed me to approach, tentatively accepting my touch. As I brushed her coat, I spoke softly, telling her about previous summers at camp, about school, about nothing in particular. The rhythm of grooming calmed both of us, and I began to think Mrs. Winters had made a good match after all. Until I heard it, a faint but distinct tapping sound coming from the barn wall behind us. Tap, tap, tap. Snowfall heard it too. Her ears swiveled backward and tension returned to her body. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, moving along the wall as if someone, or something, was walking the perimeter of the barn, dragging fingers along the wooden planks. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. "Reggie?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly unsteady. "Is someone working on the barn?" No answer came. I realized that while I'd been focused on grooming Snowfall, the other campers and staff had departed for a demonstration in the riding ring. We were alone. The tapping stopped directly behind Snowfall's stall, replaced by what sounded like soft, labored breathing. Snowfall's reaction was immediate and terrifying. She reared up, nearly striking me with her hooves, then backed against the far wall of the stall, eyes rolling to show the whites. I scrambled out of the stall, heart pounding as I secured the latch. The breathing sound ceased, followed by a heavy silence that seemed more threatening than any noise. Gathering my courage, I walked slowly around the exterior of the barn, expecting to find another camper playing a prank. There was no one there. No footprints in the soft dirt around the barn. No evidence that anyone had been circling the structure. Yet when I returned to Snowfall, she remained agitated, refusing to calm despite my best efforts. That night at dinner, I asked casually if anyone else had been at the stables during morning activities. "Everyone was at the riding demonstration," Rita confirmed, picking at her mashed potatoes. "Why?" I hesitated, unwilling to sound foolish. "No reason. Just thought I heard someone." Rita studied me for a moment, then leaned closer. "I heard something too last night. Outside our cabin. Like someone pacing back and forth." "Probably a deer," offered Bonnie confidently. "They come right up to the cabin sometimes." "Maybe," Rita said, but her expression suggested she believed otherwise. That night, I lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, listening to the sounds of the forest. The usual symphony of crickets and occasional hoots of owls should have been comforting, familiar. Instead, I found myself straining to hear anything abnormal, any indication that whatever had disturbed Snowfall was now prowling around our cabin. Just as exhaustion began to pull me toward sleep, I heard it, a soft rhythmic sound just outside our window. Tap, tap, tap. Days at Whispering Pines followed a predictable pattern. Breakfast at 7:30, morning riding lessons until lunch, afternoon activities ranging from swimming to crafts, dinner at 6 hour, and evening programs until the 9:30 lights out. This structure should have been reassuring, but as the first week progressed, small disruptions began to accumulate like shadows lengthening at dusk. Snowfall remained skittish, though she gradually accepted me as her rider. During our third morning together, as I led her from the stall to the tacking area, she suddenly halted, refusing to move forward despite gentle encouragement. "Come on, girl," I urged, tugging lightly on her lead rope. "What's wrong?" Her gaze was fixed on the dark corner of the barn where the tack room connected to the main structure. Though I saw nothing unusual, her fear was palpable. communicated through her trembling muscles and rapid breathing. After several minutes of coaxing, Snowfall finally moved forward, though she gave the corner a wide berth. As we passed, I felt a noticeable temperature drop, as if walking through a pocket of winter air despite the summer heat. Later that day, during the afternoon swim session at the small lake that bordered the western edge of camp, I overheard two counselors talking in hushed tones. Third time this week, one was saying. A tall woman named Irene who supervised the waterfront. Mrs. Winters says it's just vandals, but I don't know. The perimeter fence is intact, replied the other, a younger counselor whose name I couldn't recall. And those markings don't look like typical graffiti. They noticed me floating nearby and immediately changed the subject, switching to an overly cheerful discussion of the upcoming talent show. Their abrupt transition only heightened my curiosity and concern. That evening, I volunteered to help the kitchen staff with cleanup after dinner, hoping to glean more information from the adult conversations. As I stacked plates, the cook, a sturdy woman in her 50s everyone called Aunt Judy, was discussing maintenance issues with the groundskeeper. Another door found open this morning, the groundskeeper said, shaking his head. Storage shed near the North Trail. I know I locked it yesterday. Animals can't work latches, Aunt Judy replied, lowering her voice. And those scratches on the inside. Kids playing pranks, he interrupted firmly, noticing me nearby. Nothing to worry about. But I had heard enough to add to my growing sense of unease. Something was happening at Whispering Pines. Something the staff was trying to minimize or conceal from campers. That night, as we prepared for bed in our cabin, Cassidy complained about losing her favorite hair ribbon. I left it right on my trunk, she insisted, searching through her belongings for the third time, the blue one my grandmother gave me. Maybe it fell behind your bed? I suggested, helping her look. No, I've checked everywhere. Frustration colored her voice as she flopped onto her mattress. It's just gone. Small items had been disappearing throughout the camp. Hair accessories, a watch, a counselor's whistle, a pocket knife belonging to one of the male campers. Each instance was dismissed as carelessness or forgetfulness, but the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. As the night deepened and my cabin mates fell asleep, I found myself once again listening to the sounds outside. The usual forest noises seemed muted, as if the wildlife was deliberately quieter than normal. In that unnatural silence, I thought I heard soft footsteps circling our cabin. Not the heavy tread of a human, but something lighter, almost delicate, like fingertips walking across the ground. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around my shoulders, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, fueled by camp ghost stories and coincidences. But deep down, I knew something was watching our cabin, waiting for reasons I couldn't comprehend. The next morning, I woke before the others and stepped onto the cabin's small porch to watch the sunrise. The early light revealed something that sent ice through my veins. A neat arrangement of small objects placed on the bottom step. A blue hair ribbon, a silver whistle, a wristwatch with a cracked face, and other items I recognized as those reported missing. They were arranged in a perfect circle, like offerings at a shrine. I quickly gathered them up before the others could see, stuffing them into my pocket. Later, I discreetly returned each item to its owner, claiming I'd found them scattered near the main lodge. The relief on their faces was evident, but no one questioned how the items had ended up there, or why they'd been returned so mysteriously. No one except Rita, who cornered me after breakfast. You didn't find those things by the lodge, did you? Her voice was quiet but insistent. I hesitated, then shook my head. They were on our cabin steps this morning. Arranged in a circle, Rita's face paled. I saw something last night through the window. I thought I was dreaming, but she swallowed hard. There was someone or something outside our cabin. It was tall, so tall and thin. It moved wrong, like its joints bent in places they shouldn't. The description matched the fleeting glimpse I'd caught at the campfire. Did you tell anyone? Who would believe me? Rita looked around to ensure no one was listening. But that's not all. When it was at our window, I heard it speaking. Not words exactly, more like whispers, like it was calling to us. A counselor called for us to join our activity groups, cutting our conversation short. As I headed toward the stables, Rita grabbed my arm. Be careful, she warned. I think it's getting bolder. A week into camp, the incidents had increased in both frequency and intensity. The atmosphere at Whispering Pines had shifted. Even the most oblivious campers seemed aware that something wasn't right. Counselors traveled in pairs, walkie-talkies constantly in hand. 2 additional security lights had been installed near the barn, their harsh glow cutting through the darkness but somehow making the shadows beyond seem even darker. During Thursday's evening activity, a nature identification walk, our group discovered strange markings on several trees along the trail. Long vertical scratches ran up the trunks, too high and too uniform to be from any local wildlife. "Mountain lion," declared our guide unconvincingly, hurrying us past. "Let's move along, everyone." I lingered, studying the marks. They weren't random animal claws, but deliberate patterns. 3 parallel lines repeated at consistent intervals up the trunk, as if something had been climbing or marking territory. That night I struggled to fall asleep despite the exhaustion weighing on my limbs. Rita's breathing was uneven in the bed beside mine. She was awake too, though we didn't speak. Across the room, Bonnie and Cassidy slept peacefully, their young faces relaxed in the dim glow of the nightlight we'd started keeping on. Just past midnight, according to the watch I now kept under my pillow, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on our cabin porch. Not the random scurrying of an animal, but deliberate measured steps. Tap, pause, tap, pause. The door handle turned slowly, metal scraping against metal. I'd made sure to lock it before bed, an extra precaution I'd started taking without explaining to my cabin mates. The handle jiggled, testing the lock, then stopped. For a moment, silence resumed, and I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the sounds. Then came a new noise, soft scratching along the cabin wall, moving toward the window near my bed. Rita's sharp intake of breath told me she heard it too. The scratching circled the entire cabin, a methodical perimeter check. When it reached the window by my bed, it stopped, against every instinct screaming for me to hide under the covers. I turned my head toward the glass. A face stared back at me. In the dim light, I could make out only the barest features, a gaunt, elongated face with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes that reflected the nightlight with an unnatural gleam. It wasn't a mask or an animal, but something horrifyingly between, human enough to recognize as a face, but wrong in proportions and expression. I froze, unable to scream or move as those eyes locked with mine. The face remained motionless for several long seconds, then tilted in an unsettlingly fluid motion as if studying me. A hand pressed against the glass, long, thin fingers with too many joints, nails that looked more like curved talons. "Do you see it?" Rita whispered, her voice barely audible. I couldn't respond, couldn't break the gaze of this creature. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous and too sharp. The window began to rattle as the creature applied pressure, testing the strength of the glass. The old wooden frame creaked ominously, and I knew with terrible certainty that it wouldn't hold if the entity decided to force its way in. Just as the pressure increased to the point where I expected to hear breaking glass, a distant sound broke the standoff, the night security guard's ATV making its rounds. The creature's head snapped toward the noise, then back to me. Its mouth stretched into what might have been a smile but contained no warmth or humor, just a predatory promise of return. In a movement too quick to follow, it vanished from the window. No retreating footsteps, no rustling of underbrush, just sudden absence. Rita and I remained frozen for several minutes, neither of us willing to approach the window to confirm the creature was truly gone. Finally, I found my voice. "We need to tell someone." Rita nodded, her face pale in the dim light. "Who would believe us?" "Mrs. Winters, the security guard, anyone." My voice shook with the remnants of terror. "That thing was trying to get in." "What was it?" Rita whispered. "It looked... God, I don't even know how to describe it." "It's been watching us," I said, pieces falling into place. The missing items, the sounds at the barn, the scratches on the trees. "It's been here the whole time, watching and waiting." "For what?" I had no answer, only the chilling certainty that we'd been marked in some way, selected for reasons beyond our understanding. We spent the remainder of the night huddled on Rita's bed, backs against the wall, taking turns keeping watch until dawn lightened the sky. Bonnie and Cassidy slept through it all, blissfully unaware of our night visitor. At breakfast, Rita and I must have looked as terrible as we felt. Dark circles shadowed our eyes and we jumped at every unexpected noise. We debated how to approach Mrs. Winters with our experience, knowing how it would sound. Two teenage girls claiming to have seen a monster at their window. Our opportunity came when Mrs. Winters stopped by our table to check on the day's activities. "Mrs. Winters," I began, my voice lower than normal to avoid being overheard. "Something happened at our cabin last night, something not normal." Her expression remained neutral, but I noticed her posture stiffen slightly. "What do you mean?" Rita jumped in, clearly deciding that directness was our best approach. "There was something at our window last night. Not a person, not exactly. It tried to get in." I expected dismissal, maybe even gentle mockery, but Mrs. Winters' reaction surprised me. She glanced quickly around the dining hall, then sat down at our table. "Tell me exactly what you saw," she said, her voice unnaturally even. "Every detail." We described the night visitor as accurately as we could. Its height, the wrong proportions of its face and hands, the way it moved. As we spoke, Mrs. Winters's complexion gradually paled, and I realized with growing horror that she believed us because she'd seen it too. "Has anyone else reported similar experiences?" I asked when we finished. She hesitated, clearly weighing her response. "There have been incidents over the years. Nothing confirmed." "This was real," Rita insisted. "It was at our window trying to get in." Mrs. Winters nodded slowly. "I believe you. And I want you to know that we're taking additional security measures starting today. The camp perimeter will be checked hourly after dark, and we're bringing in extra staff for night patrols." Her words should have been reassuring, but the careful way she avoided directly acknowledging what we'd seen only deepened my unease. This wasn't a new development. This was something Whispering Pines had been dealing with for some time. "Is the camp in danger?" I asked bluntly. "No one has ever been harmed at Whispering Pines," she replied, which I noticed wasn't exactly an answer to my question. "Your safety is our primary concern. If you see or hear anything unusual again, use this." She handed us each a small whistle on a lanyard. "Security can hear these anywhere on camp property." As she walked away, Rita turned to me, her expression grim. "She knows something. This has happened before." I nodded, fingering the whistle. "And I don't think those extra security measures are going to help much. Whatever that thing is, it's not afraid of us." The following days passed in a blur of heightened vigilance. True to Mrs. Winters' word, security presence increased around camp. Additional floodlights were installed near the cabins, and counselors conducted more frequent bed checks. These measures provided little comfort, however. They seemed like flimsy defenses against what we had witnessed. Rumors spread through camp like wildfire, fueled by snippets of staff conversations and the visible increase in security. The younger campers created increasingly elaborate stories to explain the changes, ranging from escaped convicts to rabid bears. The older campers, more perceptive, recognized that something genuinely concerning was happening. Rita and I kept to ourselves, speaking in hushed tones when we were alone, comparing notes on unusual occurrences. We'd taken to sleeping in shifts, one keeping watch while the other rested. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but the alternative, being caught unaware if our visitor returned, was unthinkable. On the 5th night after our encounter, something changed in the atmosphere of the camp. The air felt thicker, charged with a strange electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Even the counselors seemed on edge, checking their walkie-talkies more frequently and hustling campers back to cabins immediately after the evening program. "Something's happening tonight," Rita whispered as we prepared for bed. "I can feel it." I nodded, unable to articulate the sense of foreboding that had settled in my chest. "We should be ready." Bonnie and Cassidy picked up on our anxiety, asking questions we couldn't or wouldn't answer truthfully. "Why do you guys keep looking out the windows?" Cassidy asked, brushing her hair before bed. "Just checking the weather," I lied. "Looks like it might rain. Are you scared of something?" Bonnie's direct question caught me off guard. Rita intervened smoothly. "We're just being cautious. You know, camp safety and all that." Eventually, the younger girls settled into their beds, falling asleep with the enviable ease of children who haven't yet learned to fear the darkness. Rita took the first watch as I tried to rest, though sleep remained elusive. Just after midnight, The electricity went out. The night light that had been our constant companion suddenly died, plunging the cabin into darkness broken only by moonlight filtering through the windows. Outside, the security floodlights had also failed, returning the camp to its natural nighttime state. Power outage, Rita whispered, moving to sit beside me on my bed. The storm must have... There is no storm, I interrupted, listening to the perfectly still night outside. No wind, no rain, no thunder, just absolute silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The walkie-talkie that Mrs. Winters had given us crackled to life, startling us both. "Attention all cabins," came a staticky voice, the head counselor, trying to sound calm but failing to hide the tension underneath. "We're experiencing a camp-wide power outage. Please remain in your cabins. Counselors will be checking in shortly with flashlights. I repeat, remain in your cabins." "They cut the power," Rita said, her voice barely audible. It wanted the lights out. The realization hit me with sickening certainty. This wasn't an accident or weather event. This was deliberate, a calculated move by something intelligent enough to understand our defenses and find a way to neutralize them. I grabbed the flashlight from under my pillow, relieved when it cast a beam of light across the cabin. The sudden illumination sent shadows dancing across the walls, momentarily mimicking movement where there was none. Should we wake them? Rita nodded toward Bonnie and Cassidy, still sleeping peacefully. Not yet, I decided. No point in scaring them if... A soft tapping at the window cut me off mid-sentence. 3 slow, deliberate taps followed by silence. Rita's hand found mine in the darkness, squeezing so tight it hurt. Neither of us moved toward the window. The tapping came again, this time at the door. Tap, tap, tap. "Hello?" called a voice from outside, unmistakably human, female, and frightened. "Is anyone awake?" "It's Irene, your counselor." We exchanged glances, momentarily relieved but still wary. "We're awake," I called back, moving cautiously toward the door. "Is everything okay?" "Power's out across camp," Irene replied. "I'm checking all the cabins in this area. Can you let me in?" Something in her tone didn't sound right, a slight strain and unnatural cadence to the words. I hesitated, my hand on the door lock. "Mrs. Winters said we should stay inside with the doors locked," I replied, improvising. "She'll be making rounds with the master keys." A pause followed, too long to be natural. "There's been a change of plans," Irene's voice came again, flatter now. "I need you to open the door. Right now." Rita shook her head violently, mouthing the word no. "We'll wait for Mrs. Winters," I insisted, backing away from the door. "Sorry, Irene." Another pause, then a sound that turned my blood to ice. A low, guttural growl that no human throat could produce. "Open the door." The voice was still recognizable as Irene's, but distorted now, as if something was forcing her vocal cords to form words they weren't designed to create. "Let me in." Bonnie stirred in her sleep, mumbling incoherently before settling again. Rita and I remained frozen, staring at the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. "Let me in." The pretense of humanity was slipping from the voice with each repetition. "Let me in." The door handle began to turn, slowly testing the lock as it had nights before. When it found resistance, the pressure increased, metal groaning under strain. "The whistle," Rita hissed, fumbling for the lanyard Mrs. Winters had given us. Before she could raise it to her lips, a new sound filled the cabin, a static-laced transmission from the walkie-talkie. "Emergency protocol initiated," came Mrs. Winters' voice, tight with controlled fear. "All cabins, code red. Repeat, code red. Remain locked down until further notice. Security teams are..." The transmission cut off abruptly. Outside our door, the thing using Irene's voice went silent. The handle stopped turning. For a moment, I dared to hope it had given up. Then came a new sound. Fingernails dragging down the wooden door, slow and deliberate, leaving what I imagined were deep gouges in their wake. The sound continued around the perimeter of the cabin, a methodical circuit that ended at the window nearest my bed. I raised the flashlight, aiming the beam at the glass. For an instant, the light illuminated a face. Not Irene's, but the elongated, hollow-eyed visage we'd seen before. Its eyes reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's, glowing with an unnatural yellow sheen. Then the window exploded inward, Glass shattered across the floor as a long, thin arm snaked through the opening. Too long for human proportions, joints bending in impossible ways. Taloned fingers grasped at the air, searching for something to grab. Bonnie and Cassidy woke with terrified screams. Rita blew her whistle with desperate force, the shrill sound piercing through the night. I acted on pure instinct, grabbing the heavy metal flashlight and bringing it down with all my strength on the grotesque limb. A howl of pain echoed through the cabin as the arm withdrew, taking chunks of broken glass with it. "Under the beds!" I shouted to Bonnie and Cassidy, who scrambled to obey, their faces white with terror. Rita continued blowing the whistle as I fumbled with the walkie-talkie, pressing the emergency transmission button. "It's breaking in," I shouted into the device. "Pinecrest cabin!" "It's breaking in," static answered me, broken by fragments of voices too distorted to understand. Outside, something large moved around the cabin, its footsteps heavy now, abandoning stealth for raw aggression. The door shuddered under a powerful impact, the wood splintering around the lock. Another blow and the frame began to crack. "What do we do?" Rita's voice was barely audible over the pounding. I looked around desperately for anything we could use as a weapon or barricade. My gaze fell on the small propane heater in the corner, the emergency heating system for when temperatures dropped unexpectedly. "The propane," I whispered, a terrible plan forming. "If it breaks in?" Rita's eyes widened as she understood my half-formed thought. "That's insane. You have a better idea?" I asked as the door splintered further, a long, taloned hand visible through the widening crack. She shook her head, then moved quickly to the heater, turning the valve to release the gas. The distinctive odor filled the cabin almost immediately. "Bonnie, Cassidy," I called to the terrified girls under the beds. "When I say now, run for the back window, the small one in the bathroom. Go through it and don't stop running until you reach the main lodge." The pounding at the door reached a crescendo, wood giving way as something forced its way inside. Through the growing opening, I caught glimpses of a nightmare-made flesh, a towering, emaciated figure with limbs too long and joints too numerous, its skin a sickly grayish white that had never seen sunlight. "Now!" I screamed, grabbing the flashlight and smashing it against the propane heater's exposed elements. Sparks flew as Bonnie and Cassidy scrambled toward the bathroom, Rita right behind them. I backed toward the bathroom door as the creature forced its way into the cabin, its full height forcing it to bend unnaturally beneath the ceiling. Its face, if it could be called that, was a hollow-cheeked approximation of human features, with eyes like black pits and a mouth stretched too wide across its lower face. For one terrible moment, our gazes locked. Intelligence burned in those inhuman eyes, not animal cunning, but something older, colder, infinitely patient. It recognized me from our previous encounters, and I knew with sickening certainty that it had chosen me specifically, though I couldn't comprehend why. Its mouth opened to reveal rows of needle-like teeth as it reached for me with those grotesquely elongated arms. The propane ignited. A whoosh of flame erupted from the heater, spreading rapidly through the gas-filled air. The creature shrieked, a sound so high-pitched and alien it threatened to shatter my eardrums. I stumbled backward through the bathroom door, slamming it shut as flames engulfed the main room. Rita had already helped Bonnie and Cassidy through the small window. She was halfway out herself, turning back with panic in her eyes. "Come on!" I scrambled toward the window, the heat of the fire already seeping through the bathroom door. Outside, I could hear the creature's inhuman screams mixing with human shouts as camp staff responded to the commotion. The window was barely large enough for me to squeeze through, glass cutting into my palms as I hauled myself out. As my feet cleared the sill, a taloned hand punched through the bathroom door, flailing blindly as flames licked at the splintered wood. We ran without looking back, the orange glow of the burning cabin lighting our way through the darkness. Behind us, inhuman screams gradually faded, replaced by the shouts of adults and the wail of distant sirens. The following hours passed in a blur of emergency vehicles, flashing lights and concerned adults asking the same questions repeatedly. Firefighters controlled the blaze before it could spread to nearby cabins or the surrounding forest. But Pinecrest was a total loss. Nothing but charred timber and ash remained by dawn. We were separated for questioning, standard procedure, we were told, for any serious incident. I sat wrapped in a scratchy emergency blanket in Mrs. Winter's office as a police officer asked me to explain what had happened. I told the truth, or a version of it. A power outage. Someone trying to break in. The propane heater accidentally knocked over in our panic. I said nothing about elongated limbs or inhuman faces. Nothing about the weeks of strange occurrences leading up to that night. The disbelief in the officer's eyes, even at my sanitized account, told me that the full truth would never be accepted. Rita, I later learned, had given a similar story. Bonnie and Cassidy, too traumatized to be questioned extensively, were quickly collected by their parents, who arrived in the early morning hours looking pale and terrified. By mid-morning, the official narrative had been established. A failed break-in attempt by vandals who had been responsible for earlier disturbances at the camp, followed by an accidental fire when the panicked campers tried to escape. The power outage was attributed to a blown transformer, though no explanation was given for why the backup generators had also failed. Mrs. Winters found me sitting alone on a bench outside the main lodge, watching as parents arrived to collect their children. Camp had been officially canceled for the remainder of the session. "Your parents will be here in about an hour," she said, sitting beside me. They were very worried. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The events of the night had left me hollow, exhausted beyond words. "What you did was very brave," she continued after a moment of silence. "You saved those girls. What was it?" I asked, my voice rough from smoke inhalation and screaming. "You know, don't you?" Mrs. Winters stared at the distant tree line, her face unreadable. "Whispering Pines has stood for over 70 years, she said finally. "In all that time there have been incidents, things we can't explain, things we don't discuss. That doesn't answer my question." She sighed, suddenly looking much older than her years. "The locals, the ones whose families have been in these mountains for generations, they have stories, legends about something that lives in these woods. Something that watches, waits, takes an interest in certain people." She glanced at me meaningfully, especially young people with sensitivity to their surroundings. "Like me," I whispered, remembering how I'd felt unsettled from the moment we arrived, how Snowfall had responded to me, how the entity had singled out our cabin. "Like you?" she confirmed. "In all my years running this camp, it's never been this bold, this aggressive. We've had sightings, minor incidents, but nothing like this." Did it die in the fire?" Mrs. Winters' expression darkened. "I doubt it. Things like that don't die easily, if at all." "Things like what?" She stood, adjusting her camp director badge. "Some questions are better left unanswered. You're safe now. That's what matters." As she walked away, I called after her. "Will you reopen the camp?" She paused, looking back over her shoulder. "Not this summer. Beyond that, we'll see." My parents arrived exactly when Mrs. Winters had predicted, their faces tight with worry as they embraced me. They asked the same questions the police had, and I gave them the same sanitized version of events. They didn't need to know about the thing in the woods. No one did, except those who had already encountered it. As we drove away from Whispering Pines, I watched the camp recede in the rearview mirror. The pine trees seemed to bend inward, creating a shadowy tunnel that swallowed the road behind us. For an instant, I thought I saw movement among the trunks, something tall and thin, moving with unnatural grace between the shadows. Then we rounded a bend, and the camp disappeared from view. 3 days after returning home, the nightmares began. They always started the same way. I was back at Whispering Pines, alone in Pinecrest Cabin. Outside, a gentle tapping would begin, first at the windows, then the walls, then the door. Tap, tap, tap. No matter how I tried to ignore it, the sound would continue, growing more insistent until I was forced to acknowledge it. In the dream, I would approach the door, knowing what waited on the other side, but unable to stop myself from reaching for the handle. As the door swung open, those hollow eyes would meet mine, that too-wide mouth stretching into a grotesque parody of a smile. Long, taloned fingers would reach for me. I would wake, gasping, sheets soaked with sweat. The phantom sensation of cold fingers brushing my face lingering in the darkness of my bedroom. My parents attributed my disturbed sleep to trauma from the fire, suggesting therapy to help process the experience. I agreed, not because I believed it would help, but because I needed someone to talk to who was bound by confidentiality. Dr. Mercer was in her 50s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that I appreciated. During our first session, I told her the official version of events, testing her reactions, gauging whether she might be receptive to the truth. "You seem to be holding something back," she observed after I finished my sanitized account. "Something you're afraid to share." The perceptiveness of her comment caught me off guard. "Would you believe me if I told you what really happened?" "Try me," she replied simply. So I did. I told her everything. The weeks of strange occurrences, the entity at the window, its unnatural appearance and behavior, the deliberate power outage, the final confrontation. I described its elongated limbs and hollow face, the intelligence in its eyes, the way it had systematically targeted our cabin. Throughout my account, Dr. Mercer remained silent, her expression neutral. When I finished, she didn't immediately speak, instead writing something in her notepad. "You think I'm making this up?" I said, disappointment creeping into my voice. "No," she replied, surprising me. "I think you genuinely believe what you're telling me. But you don't believe it's real." Dr. Mercer set her notepad aside. "What I believe isn't important. What matters is understanding why you experience things this way." It was the response I should have expected, yet it still stung. Even in this safe space, the truth was too bizarre to be accepted at face value. "Have you spoken with any of the other girls since returning home?" she asked, changing the subject slightly. I shook my head. Their parents probably wouldn't want them talking to me. I'm the one who set the cabin on fire, remember? "You saved their lives," Dr. Mercer corrected gently. "Perhaps connecting with them would help all of you process what happened." The suggestion lingered in my mind after the session ended. That evening, I gathered my courage and called Rita's home number, which I'd gotten from the camp directory before leaving. Her mother answered, her tone immediately cooling when I introduced myself. "Rita's been through quite enough," she said tersely. "I don't think speaking with you would be helpful right now." "Please," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "I just need to know if she's okay. If she's been having nightmares too." A long pause followed, then the sound of the phone changing hands. "Hello?" Rita's voice was thin, strained, but unmistakably hers. Relief flooded through me. "Rita, it's me. Are you okay?" "Define okay," she replied with a weak attempt at humor. "I'm not sleeping much, you?" "Nightmares," I admitted. "Every night. Me too." "Same dream?" Opening the door and seeing it there? "Yeah." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But that's not the worst part. Sometimes when I'm awake, I think I see it. Just glimpses, through windows and mirrors at the edge of my vision. Like it followed me home. A chill ran down my spine. I'd had the same experiences. Fleeting shadows and reflective surfaces, the sensation of being watched. Moments when the air would suddenly grow cold for no apparent reason. "Have you told anyone?" I asked. "Who would believe me? They all think we're traumatized from the break-in and fire. My parents have me seeing a therapist 3 times a week. Mine too. 1 session so far. Does it help?" The hope in her voice was painful to hear. "Not really," I admitted. "They can't help with something they don't believe is real." We talked for nearly an hour, comparing experiences, finding comfort in shared understanding. Before hanging up, Rita asked the question that had been haunting me since that night. "Do you think it's really gone? Or is it still out there watching us?" I hesitated, remembering Mrs. Winter's words. "I don't think it's gone. I think it's waiting." "For what?" "I don't know," I replied honestly. "But we survived once. We can do it again if we have to." After hanging up, I sat at my desk staring at my reflection in the darkened computer screen. For an instant, I thought I saw something move behind me. A tall, thin shadow with too many joints. I spun around, heart racing, but found only my empty bedroom. That night, I left the lights on while I slept. A childish defense against the darkness, but one that brought small comfort. The nightmares came anyway, but this time something was different. As the entity reached for me with those impossibly long fingers, I found myself standing my ground instead of cowering in fear. "What do you want?" I demanded in the dream. Its mouth opened wider than any human mouth could stretch, but no sound emerged. Instead, I felt its answer in my mind, Not words exactly, but impressions, emotions, ancient hunger. It wanted me. Not my body or my life, but something deeper. My fear, my awareness, my recognition of its existence. It had been watching, waiting, selecting those who could truly see it, truly fear it. I woke with a startling revelation. Its power came from our fear. The more terrified we were, the stronger its hold became. Rita and I had been ideal targets, sensitive to our surroundings, quick to notice the abnormal, prone to the very fear it craved. The next morning, I called Rita again, eager to share my insight. But the person who answered wasn't Rita or her mother. "Hello?" A man's voice, professional and detached. "I'm calling for Rita," I said, confused. "Is this the right number?" A pause. "This is Detective Morris with the County Police Department. May I ask who's calling?" My blood ran cold. "Is Rita okay?" "What happened?" Another pause, longer this time. "I'm afraid there was an incident last night. Rita is in the hospital." "Who am I speaking with?" I identified myself, then pressed for details. The detective was reluctant at first, but eventually shared the bare facts. Rita had been found unconscious in her bathroom, an apparent suicide attempt. She had left a note claiming it wouldn't leave her alone. "Did she describe what it was?" I asked, my voice shaking. "That's not something I can discuss," the detective replied. "But I'd like to speak with you in person. Rita mentioned your name in her note." We arranged to meet that afternoon at the local police station. My parents were concerned but supportive, assuming Rita's hospitalization was related to trauma from the fire. Detective Morris was in his 40s. With tired eyes and the demeanor of someone who had seen too much, he led me to a small interview room, assuring my waiting parents that this was just a routine conversation. "Rita's going to be okay physically," he began once we were seated. "But she's been placed on a 72-hour psychiatric hold for evaluation." "She's not crazy," I said immediately. "Whatever she told you, whatever was in that note, it's real." The detective studied me carefully. "She described a creature stalking her, something inhuman that followed her home from camp. She said you would confirm her story." I hesitated, weighing my options. If I told the truth, I risked being dismissed as another traumatized teenager. If I lied, I betrayed Rita and denied what I knew to be real. "I saw it too," I said finally. "At camp and since coming home." Detective Morris didn't react with the skepticism I expected. Instead, he opened a folder on the table between us, removing several photographs. "These were taken at Whispering Pines after the fire," he explained, sliding them toward me. "Standard procedure for documenting the scene." The photos showed the charred remains of Pinecrest Cabin, the blackened timber and melted metal of what had once been our temporary home. Nothing unusual, until I noticed what the detective was pointing to in one image. In the ash and debris near what had been the cabin door, clearly visible despite the destruction, was a set of footprints. Not human footprints. They were too long, too narrow, with distinct impressions that looked like elongated toes ending in points. "The forensics team can't identify these," Detective Morris said quietly. "They don't match any known animal or human pattern." I stared at the photo, a mixture of vindication and renewed terror washing over me. It was there, just like we said. The detective collected the photos, returning them to his folder. "There's something else. This isn't the first incident connected to that camp. There have been others over the years. Campers reporting strange sightings, unexplained occurrences. Most were dismissed as pranks or overactive imaginations. But now, you believe us," I said, hardly daring to hope. "Let's say I'm keeping an open mind." He handed me his card. "If you experience anything unusual, anything at all, call me directly. Day or night." As I stood to leave, a thought occurred to me. "Detective, what's going to happen to Rita?" His expression softened slightly. "That depends on the psychiatric evaluation. But given the physical evidence we've found, I'll be advocating for her release. In the meantime, be careful. If whatever you both saw is real, it's real," I assured him. "And it's not finished with us." 2 weeks passed. Rita was released from psychiatric hold after 4 days, largely thanks to Detective Morris's intervention. We spoke daily, comparing notes on our experiences, supporting each other through nightmares and moments of panic. The sightings continued, glimpses of something tall and thin at the edges of our vision, reflections that moved independently, the sensation of being watched when we were alone. But as we shared these experiences, cataloging them, analyzing them, something began to change. The fear that had once paralyzed us gradually transformed into something else: determination, even anger. It feeds on fear, I explained to Rita during one of our calls. The more afraid we are, the stronger its connection to us becomes. So what do? Just stop being afraid? Easier said than done. Not stop being afraid, I clarified. Accept the fear, but don't let it control us. Like exposure therapy. We developed strategies for confronting our fears, sleeping with lights on initially, then gradually reducing the illumination. Deliberately looking at reflective surfaces rather than avoiding them. Speaking aloud when we sensed a presence, acknowledging it without cowering from it. Detective Morris became an unexpected ally, checking in regularly and sharing information from his ongoing investigation into Whispering Pines. The camp remained closed for renovations, though rumors suggested it might never reopen. Exactly 1 month after our escape from Pinecrest Cabin, the nightmares reached their peak. In my dream, I found myself back at camp, standing alone in the burned shell of our cabin. The entity emerged from the charred remains, its elongated, form unfolding like some grotesque origami creation, those hollow eyes fixed on mine. But this time, instead of running, I stood my ground. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," I declared, the words feeling true even as I spoke them. The creature tilted its head, studying me with those empty eyes. Its mouth opened in that too wide grimace, but instead of lunging for me, it began to fade. Like a photograph left in sunlight, its edges blurred, its form becoming transparent. I woke with a gasp, but not from terror, from a profound sense of release. The oppressive presence that had haunted my room for weeks was gone, leaving only ordinary darkness. I called Rita immediately despite the early hour. She answered on the first ring. "It's gone," she said without preamble. "I can feel it. It's not watching anymore." "I know," I replied, relief washing over me. "I think we did it. We broke its hold." The change was gradual but unmistakable. The sightings stopped. The nightmares faded. The constant sensation of being observed disappeared. By the time school started in September, we had begun to heal, though neither of us would ever be quite the same. Detective Morris called occasionally, updating us on his investigation. Whispering Pines remained closed indefinitely. Mrs. Winters had retired suddenly, moving to Arizona without leaving a forwarding address. Most significantly, Morris had uncovered records of similar incidents dating back to the camp's founding in the 1950s. Periodic cycles of strange occurrences, always centered around certain campers who seemed to attract the entity's attention. "Whatever it was," he told me during our final conversation, "it's been there a long time. And you two are the first to drive it away, as far as I can tell." "We didn't drive it away," I corrected him. "We just stopped giving it what it wanted." I've never returned to Whispering Pines. According to local news reports, the property was sold to developers the following year, the buildings demolished to make way for luxury vacation homes. I wonder sometimes if the new residents experience anything unusual, unexplained sounds in the night, the sensation of being watched, glimpses of something tall and thin moving between the trees. Rita and I still talk occasionally, though less frequently as the years pass and life pulls us in different directions. We never speak of that summer to anyone else. Who would believe us? Even with Detective Morris's evidence, our experience remains firmly in the realm of the unexplainable. But sometimes when I find myself alone in unfamiliar woods, I feel a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I don't run and I don't cower. Instead, I turn and face the shadows directly, acknowledging the fear without surrendering to it. After all, there are things in this world that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. Things that gain power from our terror and fade when confronted with courage. I learned that lesson at Whispering Pines, in a summer that taught me the true nature of fear and the strength that comes from facing it. Some nights I still dream of those hollow eyes and that too wide smile. But in my dreams now, I'm the one who turns away first, denying it the fear it craves, leaving it to fade back into the darkness where it belongs. It was at the start of my 6th grade year, back in 2019, when my entire class boarded buses for what would become the most unsettling experience of my young life. We were heading to Camp Pinewood for a 3-day environmental education trip located deep in the Appalachian foothills. The excitement among my classmates was palpable as we wound through increasingly remote roads, the dense forest pressing in from both sides. When we finally arrived, the camp appeared innocent enough, a collection of wooden structures scattered across a clearing, surrounded by towering pines that blocked much of the afternoon sunlight. Ms. Rivera, our science teacher, gathered us near the flagpole for orientation while Mr. Kendall, the assistant principal, checked in with the camp staff. "Listen up, everyone," Ms. Rivera called out. "The staff will assign your accommodation shortly. Remember that we're guests in nature's home, so respect the grounds and wildlife." It wasn't until the accommodation assignments began that the first warning sign appeared. The boys were directed toward proper cabins, sturdy structures with real doors, windows with screens, and from what I glimpsed through an open door, air conditioning units. Meanwhile, we girls were led down a dirt path to what the enthusiastic camp guide, Mrs. Winters, called rustic eco-shelters. "These authentic structures will connect you directly with nature," she explained with rehearsed cheerfulness. What stood before us were essentially wooden platforms with partial walls and roofs, more like open-air shelters than actual cabins. The doors were nothing but torn mesh screens hanging loosely from wooden frames. Inside, thin foam mats were arranged in rows on the rough wooden floors. The bathroom facilities were in a separate building approximately 3 minutes away by foot. My friend Haley whispered to me, "Are you kidding? The boys get real cabins and we get this?" I nodded, watching as insects already began finding their way inside. Apparently, environmental education means different things depending on your gender. Our classmate Iris approached us, her face showing the concern we all felt. "My mom would freak if she saw this. Do you think we could call home?" Mrs. Winters overheard. "Cell service is spotty out here, girls. Part of the experience. You'll adjust in no time." As we reluctantly arranged our sleeping bags on the uncomfortable mats, I noticed how the afternoon shadows cast strange patterns through the trees onto our shelter walls. Though it was only mid-afternoon, there was something disquieting about the way darkness seemed to pool in the corners of our shelter. That evening, after a bland dinner of overcooked pasta and watery sauce in the mess hall, we had our first nature circle, where camp counselors shared stories about local wildlife. One counselor, a gaunt man named Mr. Byrne, seemed particularly focused on the concept of adaptation. "Animals can change to look like things they're not," he explained. "Camouflage, mimicry. Nature's greatest survivors are often the greatest deceivers." As we walked back to our shelters in the growing darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us from just beyond the tree line. That first night, none of us slept well. The temperature dropped considerably after sunset, and our thin sleeping bags offered minimal protection against the cold that seeped up through the wooden floor. Several girls had already developed coughs, and the sound of stifled sniffling punctuated the night. "This is ridiculous," Haley muttered, as we tried to get comfortable. "Why do the boys get actual cabins while we freeze out here?" The girls in our shelter split into 2 factions. Those who remained outside complaining about which shelter might offer better protection, and those of us who stayed inside trying to care for the girls already developing colds. Haley and I found ourselves playing nurse, distributing tissues and the few cough drops we had between us. "At least we'll be immune," I joked to Haley as we helped Brooke, who was already developing a fever. "Healthcare heroes." "Speak for yourself," Haley replied. "I feel a tickle in my throat already." Around 11 p.m., when most had finally settled into uneasy sleep, disaster struck. Someone, I never discovered who, knocked over my water bottle in the darkness. The cold water soaked through my sleeping bag and pajamas, leaving me shivering and wide awake. "Perfect," I whispered to myself, moving my sleeping bag to a less damp spot. I knew sleep would be impossible now. The night sounds intensified as the hours crawled by. Wind rattled the loose screen door. Something small scurried across the roof. From nearby came a sound like fingernails dragging across wood, probably tree branches against a neighboring shelter. But in the darkness, imagination transformed it into something more sinister. Haley remained awake with me, both of us speaking in hushed tones about school and home, anything to distract from our surroundings. Around 2 a.m., when the forest seemed at its darkest and most hostile, the wooden floor creaked as someone stirred. I squinted in the darkness to see Iris sitting up, reaching for her glasses on the small shelf beside her mat. She fumbled for her water bottle, placed it in the pocket of her sweatshirt, and stood up. "Bathroom," she whispered when she noticed us watching her. She shuffled toward the screen door, pushed it aside with a scraping sound, and disappeared into the darkness outside. Haley and I continued our whispered conversation, but after several minutes, concern began to grow. "Iris has been gone a while," Haley noted, glancing toward the path that led to the bathrooms. Through the gaps in our shelter walls, we could just make out the outline of the bathroom building, a single light glowing above its entrance. "Should we check on her?" I asked. "Give her a few more minutes," Haley suggested. Maybe there was a line. 5 more minutes passed. 10. The bathroom building remained dimly lit but showed no signs of activity. "Something doesn't feel right," Haley said finally. "I'm going to check." As Haley stood to leave, I decided to borrow Iris's sleeping bag since mine was still damp. I crawled over to where she had been sleeping, ready to temporarily repurpose her bedding, only to freeze in confusion. There, beneath the covers, was Iris herself, sleeping soundly with her sleeping bag pulled up to her chin. My mind struggled to process this impossibility. I reached out tentatively and pulled the sleeping bag down slightly. Iris stirred, her eyes opening groggily. "What's wrong?" she murmured. I couldn't speak. If Iris was here, then who had we seen get up and walk to the bathroom? When Haley returned moments later, her face was pale even in the darkness. "No one's in the bathroom," she reported. "No one's out there at all." Morning arrived with thin gray light filtering through the trees. Few of us had managed much sleep after the incident, though we hadn't shared the full story with everyone. Iris was genuinely confused when we described watching her get up and leave. "I never went to the bathroom," she insisted. "I took my contacts out before bed. I couldn't even find my way there without my glasses, and I didn't get up all night." At breakfast, I noticed the stark difference between our group and the boys. Most of the girls looked exhausted, with dark circles under their eyes, while the boys seemed well-rested and energetic. When we tried to explain our concerns to Ms. Rivera, she dismissed them as first-night jitters. "You'll adjust," she assured us. "Today's activities will take your mind off things." Our first activity was a nature hike led by Mr. Byrne, the gaunt counselor from the previous evening. He led us deep into the forest, pointing out various plants and animal signs. As we walked, I noticed how the dense canopy overhead created an unsettling effect, patches of bright light interspersed with deep shadow, making it difficult to see clearly through the trees. "This forest has been here for centuries," Mr. Byrne explained as we stopped in a small clearing. "Native tribes believed these woods were special, a place where the boundary between worlds grew thin." "What does that mean?" a boy named Will asked. Mr. Byrne smiled thinly. "Some places collect energies, absorb experiences, mirror them back." He gestured around us. "People have been walking these paths for hundreds of years. Sometimes they leave impressions behind." Something about his explanation sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cool forest air. During lunch, Haley developed the same cough that was now affecting nearly half the girls in our group. I watched with growing concern as she picked at her food, her usual appetite gone. "I should have stayed home," she said miserably. "This whole trip is a disaster." The afternoon activity was pond ecology, which involved collecting water samples from a stagnant pond at the edge of the camp property. As I knelt by the water, I noticed something odd. When the surface was still, it reflected the surroundings with unusual clarity, almost like a perfect mirror. But occasionally the reflection seemed wrong somehow, movements that didn't correspond to anything on our side of the water. When I pointed this out to Ms. Rivera, she explained it as fish disturbing the water from below. But I wasn't convinced. There was something deliberate about the movements, as if the reflection were operating independently. By dinner, 3 more girls had developed fevers. The camp nurse, a young woman named Ms. Patel who seemed overwhelmed by the number of sick students, distributed fever reducers and advised rest. I couldn't help but notice that none of the boys had fallen ill. As darkness fell on our second night, an unnatural silence descended on the camp. Even the insects seemed to have gone quiet. In our shelter, those who weren't coughing were whispering theories about what had happened the previous night. Maybe it was someone playing a prank, suggested Nina, a girl from another class. But we saw Iris, Haley insisted, between coughs, or someone who looked exactly like her. Iris, who had been quiet most of the day, finally spoke up. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened to me," she said softly. "At my grandmother's house last year, my mom saw me in the kitchen when I was actually upstairs. And before that, my dad swore he drove me to soccer practice, but I was home the whole time." A heavy silence followed her words. "What are you saying?" I finally asked. Iris shrugged, her expression troubled. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's following me." Our third day at Camp Pinewood began with rain, a steady, penetrating downpour that transformed the dirt paths into muddy streams and leaked through the shelter roofs in multiple places. The camp staff scrambled to distribute plastic tarps, but these provided minimal protection against the elements. "Today's outdoor activities will be replaced with indoor nature crafts," announced Mrs. Winters, her perpetual cheerfulness finally showing signs of strain. The craft session was held in the mess hall, where we made leaf pressings and pine cone bird feeders while the rain drummed relentlessly on the roof. I noticed Ms. Rivera in deep conversation with Mr. Kendall in the corner, both looking concerned as they glanced at their phones. Haley's condition had worsened overnight. Her forehead burned with fever, and she could barely focus on the craft in front of her. Nearly 2/3 of the girls were now showing symptoms, compared to only a handful of boys. During a bathroom break, I overheard Mr. Kendall on his phone, his voice tense. "No, we still can't get through. The road's completely flooded. Yes, I understand the concerns, but we're stuck here until the water recedes." My stomach tightened. We were supposed to leave tomorrow, but it sounded like that might not happen. When I returned to the table, Iris was waiting for me, her expression grave. "I saw it again," she whispered. "When I was washing my hands just now. In the mirror, my reflection turned and walked away while I was standing still." Before I could respond, Ms. Rivera called for everyone's attention. "Due to the weather conditions, the road to camp is temporarily impassable," she announced, confirming my fears. "We've been assured it should clear by tomorrow afternoon, so we'll be extending our stay by 1 night. The camp staff is making arrangements to accommodate us comfortably." A chorus of groans rose from the girls' side of the room. Another night in those leaking shelters seemed unbearable, especially with so many now ill. Additionally, Ms. Rivera continued, due to the number of students feeling unwell, we'll be converting part of the main lodge into a temporary infirmary. Those with fevers will sleep there tonight under supervision. After lunch, Haley was among those moved to the infirmary, a hastily arranged row of cots in what normally served as the camp's craft room. I helped her settle in, worried by how weak she'd become in just 2 days. "Don't leave me here," she whispered, clutching my hand. "Something's wrong with this place." "It's just a bad cold," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. "You'll feel better with proper rest." But as I looked around at the dozen girls now confined to the infirmary, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than coincidence. Why were the girls getting sick while the boys remained largely unaffected? That afternoon, with outdoor activities still canceled, Mr. Byrne led an impromptu session on local folklore. His stories grew increasingly disturbing. Tales of lost hikers who were found miles from where they should have been. Accounts of people seeing impossible things in the forest depths. Legends of mirror people who could imitate anyone perfectly. The native peoples believe that each person has a shadow self, he explained, his eyes glittering in the dim light of the lodge. A perfect copy that lives in reflection, wanting nothing more than to cross over and take your place. A chill ran down my back as his words connected with what we'd experienced. When I glanced at Iris beside me, her face had gone pale. As darkness fell once again, the rain finally stopped, but the damage was done. Mud surrounded our shelters and several sleeping mats were soaked through. With no spare bedding available, we were forced to crowd together on the remaining dry spots. That night, as we huddled in our damp shelter, listening to the dripping water and occasional distant cough from the infirmary, no one slept. Every shadow seemed threatening, every sound a potential danger. We were isolated, trapped by flooded roads, surrounded by ancient forest, and increasingly convinced that something in this place meant us harm. The fourth night at camp was when everything escalated. With Haley in the infirmary, I found myself especially on edge. Iris and I had pushed our sleeping mats together near the center of the shelter, where the roof leaked least. Around midnight, when most of the others had finally fallen into uneasy sleep, Iris turned to me. "I need to tell you something," she whispered. "Something I saw this afternoon." I waited, watching her face in the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. "I went to check on Haley in the infirmary after dinner," she continued. "But when I got there, I saw myself, standing by her bed, holding her hand. I watched from the doorway as this other me leaned down and whispered something in Haley's ear. Then she straightened up and walked toward the back door. When it passed by a window, I couldn't see its reflection in the glass. 'That's impossible,' I whispered, though after what we'd already experienced, I wasn't so sure. When I reached Haley, she was delirious with fever. She kept saying, 'Don't let it take me. It's not Iris, it's not her.' My heart pounded so loudly I was certain it would wake the others. 'What did you do?' I told Ms. Patel, but she just gave Haley more fever medication and told me I was overreacting. Iris gripped my arm. 'But I know what I saw, and it's getting stronger.' We fell silent as someone stirred nearby. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep filled with dreams of silent figures walking through mirrors. I woke suddenly to the sound of movement. Opening my eyes, I saw a figure silhouetted against the mesh screen door, someone getting up to leave. In the darkness, it looked like Iris, with her distinctive curly hair outlined in the faint moonlight. I glanced beside me, expecting to find her sleeping mat empty. But Iris was still there, breathing deeply in sleep. My blood froze. Moving with glacial slowness, I sat up, eyes fixed on the figure by the door. It paused as if sensing my attention, then turned slightly toward me. Though I couldn't make out its features in the darkness, I felt its awareness, its focus shifting to me with terrible precision. For a moment that stretched like eternity, we regarded each other across the shelter. Then, with deliberate slowness, it pushed aside the screen door and stepped outside. I should have woken Iris. I should have stayed in the relative safety of our shelter. Instead, some compulsion drove me to my feet. Heart hammering, I moved to the door and peered out. The figure, Iris's double, stood on the path looking back at me. The moon had emerged from behind clouds, casting enough light to see that while it resembled Iris in overall shape and size, something was profoundly wrong with its proportions. Its arms seemed too long, its head slightly misshapen. It raised a hand, not in greeting but in beckoning, then turned and walked toward the bathrooms. "Wait," I called softly, surprising myself. "What are you?" It paused but didn't turn around. Instead, it continued walking, its movements fluid yet somehow wrong, like a poor imitation of human locomotion. Against all better judgment, I followed it, staying several yards behind. My bare feet were cold against the damp earth as I trailed the figure to the bathroom building. It pushed open the door and disappeared inside. I hesitated at the entrance, every instinct screaming danger. Through the small window, I could see lights were on inside. Finally, gathering my courage, I pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty. I checked each stall, looked behind the shower curtains, even peered out the small window at the back. Nothing. Whatever I had followed had vanished. As I turned to leave, movement in the large mirror above the sinks caught my eye. I froze, watching in horror as my reflection acted independently, turning its head to track something I couldn't see. Then it smiled, a terrible, wrong smile that I wasn't making, and raised one finger to its lips in a shushing gesture. I stumbled backward, colliding with the paper towel dispenser. My reflection moved normally again, mimicking my startled reaction. Had I imagined it? Shaking, I rushed back to our shelter, only to find chaos had erupted in my absence. Girls were crowded around Iris's sleeping mat, where she sat rigid with terror. She was here, Iris was saying, her voice high with panic. She stood right over me, looking down. She had my face. Several girls were trying to calm her while others had backed away, clearly frightened themselves. When Iris saw me, she pointed accusingly. You were with it. I saw you follow it outside. All eyes turned to me. I thought it was you getting up, I stammered. I followed because I was worried. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Nina asked the question we were all thinking. What's happening to us? By morning, word of the night's events had spread throughout the camp. The boys, initially skeptical, became more concerned when several of them admitted to seeing strange reflections in windows and puddles, faces watching them that didn't belong to anyone at camp. Ms. Rivera called an emergency meeting in the mess hall. Her professional demeanor had cracked, revealing genuine worry beneath. I understand many of you are experiencing unusual phenomena, she began carefully. The camp director assures me this is likely the result of a combination of factors, unfamiliar surroundings, group anxiety, and possibly mild hallucinations from the fever affecting some students. No one looked convinced. The good news, she continued, is that the roads should be clear by mid-afternoon. Buses will arrive to take us home around 4 o'clock. I'm asking everyone to stay in groups today and report anything unusual to an adult immediately. After breakfast, I visited Haley in the infirmary. Her fever had broken overnight, but she looked exhausted with dark circles under her eyes. They've been coming, she whispered when I sat beside her cot. At night when the nurse falls asleep. People who look like us but aren't. They stand in the corners and watch. I told her about following Iris's double to the bathroom, about what I'd seen in the mirror. Saying it aloud in daylight should have made it seem absurd, but Haley nodded as if it confirmed her own experiences. There's something Mr. Byrne didn't finish telling us, she said. I overheard him talking to another counselor yesterday. This camp, it wasn't just built on native land. It was built on what they called a mirror place, somewhere the boundary between worlds is damaged. What does that mean? Haley leaned closer. It means things can cross over, take shapes from our memories, our perceptions, create doubles, but why? What do they want? She gripped my hand, her palm cold despite her recent fever. To replace us, one by one. The rest of the morning passed in tense anticipation of departure. The camp staff kept us busy with simple indoor activities, but no one could focus. Every reflection, every shadow drew suspicious glances. Shortly after lunch, Mr. Kendall received a call that visibly relieved him. The buses are on their way, he announced. Everyone, please pack your belongings and be ready at the main lodge by 3:30. As we returned to our shelters to gather our things, an eerie stillness had fallen over the camp. Even the birds had gone quiet. Inside our shelter, Iris was already packing, her movements quick and nervous. I just want to go home, she said when she saw me. I never want to see this place again. I nodded, stuffing my damp sleeping bag into its compression sack. Did you sleep at all after? No. She zipped her duffel bag with unnecessary force. And I'm never coming back to these woods, ever. As we worked, Nina approached us, her expression troubled. Have either of you seen Brooke? She was supposed to help me clean up our corner, but I can't find her anywhere. I frowned. Have you checked the infirmary? Maybe her fever came back. Already looked. Ms. Patel hasn't seen her since morning check. A familiar unease crept up my spine. Let's go find Ms. Rivera. We found our teacher outside the main lodge, checking names off a list. Her face grew serious when we explained about Brooke's disappearance. She's probably just wandered off to the craft room or nature center, she said, but her tone lacked conviction. I'll have the staff search the buildings. You girls stay here where I can see you. As the minutes ticked by, more staff joined the search for Brooke. Mr. Byrne organized the students into the main lodge, where we sat in uncomfortable silence, avoiding each other's eyes. Every time the door opened, we looked up expectantly, but Brooke didn't appear. At 3 o'clock, with the buses due any minute, Mr. Kendall made a decision. Most of you will return home as planned. A few staff members and I will remain behind with Ms. Rivera to continue searching for Brooke. Her parents have been notified and are on their way. Relief at leaving mixed with guilt about abandoning the search. As we filed out of the lodge toward the waiting buses, I glanced back at the camp that had terrified us for 4 days. In a window of the main building, I caught a glimpse of a familiar face. Brooke watching us leave, her expression blank. I blinked and she was gone. On the bus, Iris sat beside me, Haley across the aisle. None of us spoke as the camp disappeared behind us, swallowed by the dense forest. It wasn't until we were on the main highway that Iris finally broke the silence. They found her, didn't they? That's why they're letting us leave. I didn't answer. I couldn't be certain what I'd seen in that window. If it was really Brooke or something wearing her appearance like a poorly fitting mask. The weeks following our return from Camp Pinewood passed in a blur of normalcy that felt almost surreal after our experiences. Parents had been told that a stomach virus had swept through the camp, explaining the extended stay and multiple illnesses. Brooke had apparently been found hiding in a storage closet, suffering from fever-induced confusion. At least, that was the official story. But things weren't right. Anyone who had been at camp could sense it. First, there were the subtle changes in Brooke. She returned to school 3 days after us, quieter than before, with a new habit of staring at her reflection whenever she passed a mirror or window. She avoided those of us who had been in her shelter, sitting with different friends at lunch. Then came the incidents with Iris. Twice in 1 week. Her mother called the school because Iris hadn't come home, only for Iris to insist she had never left the building. A teacher reported seeing her in 2 places simultaneously. Friends described conversations with her that she had no memory of. Haley and I tried to discuss what was happening, but each conversation left us more confused and frightened. We had experienced something impossible, something that defied rational explanation, yet life expected us to continue as if nothing had changed. I keep seeing things in reflections, Haley confessed one afternoon as we walked home. Movements that shouldn't be there. Faces watching me. I nodded, having experienced the same. Do you think they followed us home? Haley didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was barely audible. I think they were always here. We just didn't know how to see them until Camp Pinewood showed us. A month after our return, Ms. Rivera didn't come to school. The principal announced she had taken an indefinite leave of absence for health reasons. Rumors spread that she had suffered some kind of breakdown, repeatedly claiming that her reflection was trying to climb out of her bathroom mirror. 3 days later, Iris didn't come to school. This time, when her mother called, it wasn't because Iris was missing. It was because she had woken to find 2 identical daughters in her home, both claiming to be the real Iris, both with identical memories and mannerisms. The school counselor called an emergency meeting for all students who had attended the camp. In clinical terms, she explained the concept of mass hysteria and shared psychotic disorder, assuring us that what we had experienced was a product of suggestion and group anxiety, not supernatural phenomena. Few were convinced. After school, Haley and I visited Iris at her home. Her mother let us in with a strained smile, explaining that Iris was resting but could see us briefly. She didn't mention the incident with the double, and we didn't ask. Iris was sitting by her bedroom window, staring out at nothing in particular. She'd lost weight, and her usually lively eyes seemed dull. "Hey," she said when we entered, not turning from the window. "How's school?" We made awkward small talk for a few minutes before Haley finally addressed what we were all thinking about. "Has it happened again?" "Since that morning?" Iris nodded slowly. "They're getting better at it. More convincing. Last night even I couldn't tell which was the reflection and which was me." She finally turned to face us. "I think next time I might be the one who disappears." "Don't say that," I urged. "We'll figure this out." But Iris just smiled sadly. "You can't fight what you don't understand. And we're just kids. No one believes us." As we left, Iris's mother pulled us aside in the hallway. "Did she seem normal to you?" she whispered, eyes darting toward the bedroom door. The question chilled me to the bone. "What do you mean?" "She's been different since that camp. Distant. Sometimes I walk into a room and don't recognize her expression. Like someone else is looking through her eyes." She gripped my arm. "The doctors say it's just trauma from getting lost in the woods, but they didn't see what I saw that morning. 2 identical girls, both my daughter in every way." "Which one stayed?" Haley asked softly. Iris's mother released my arm, her eyes suddenly guarded. "My daughter stayed, of course. The other, Disappeared when I called the police. She straightened, composing herself. Forgive me. The stress has been tremendous. Thank you for visiting. As the front door closed behind us, Haley and I exchanged horrified glances. The same question burned in both our minds. Was the girl we'd just spoken to really Iris or something that had taken her place? 5 years have passed since Camp Pinewood. I'm in high school now, preparing for college applications and trying to focus on a normal future. But normalcy remains elusive for those of us who experienced those 4 days in the woods. Brooke's family moved away 6 months after our return. I sometimes see her on social media, or someone using her accounts. In every photo, she stands slightly apart from others, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Miss Rivera never returned to teaching. I ran into her once at a grocery store. She was thinner, jumpier, with a new habit of covering mirrors and avoiding reflective surfaces. She pretended not to recognize me. Haley and I have remained friends, bound by our shared experience and unspoken fear. We developed coping mechanisms, never looking too long at reflections, avoiding forests and standing water, staying in well-lit areas whenever possible. Small precautions that probably do nothing but make us feel safer. Iris's story is the hardest to tell. 3 months after our visit to her home, her mother found her room empty one morning. A massive search turned up nothing. The official conclusion was runaway or abduction, but those of us who knew the truth recognized what had really happened. Whatever had been studying us at camp had finally perfected its imitation and taken her place. The thing wearing Iris's appearance attended school for another week before disappearing as well. I sometimes wonder if it moved on to another target, or simply returned to whatever place it came from, its purpose fulfilled. I've researched mirror folklore extensively in the years since, learning that virtually every culture has myths about reflections and doubles. The Japanese call them mononoke, the Germans doppelgangers, the Egyptians ska, different names for the same phenomenon. Entities that watch us from reflective surfaces, learning to become us. Most nights, I can convince myself it was all just a shared delusion, the product of suggestible young minds in a strange environment. But then I'll catch a glimpse of movement in a storefront window, or see my reflection hesitate a microsecond too long, and the old fear returns full force. Last week, my mother commented that I seemed different lately. More confident, she said, but somehow changed. I smiled and thanked her for the compliment while my heart raced with terror. Had she noticed something I hadn't? Was I still myself? Or had I already been replaced without realizing it? The most disturbing theory, the one that keeps me awake on the darkest nights, is that there was nothing supernatural at Camp Pinewood at all. No mirror entities, no boundary between worlds. Just the terrifying realization that identity is fragile. That with enough pressure and the right environment, we can fracture into versions of ourselves we no longer recognize. I avoid school reunions and rarely look up old classmates online. I'm afraid of what I might see in their faces, or what they might see in mine. Some questions are better left unanswered, some reflections better left unexamined. But sometimes when I'm alone, I find myself drawn to mirrors despite my fear. I stand before my reflection and search for signs that something isn't right, a movement out of sync, an expression I didn't make. So far, my reflection has remained faithful. So far. But Camp Pinewood taught me that reflections lie. That what looks back at us from mirrored surfaces isn't always what it seems. And sometimes, when the light hits just right, I swear I can see something moving in the depths beyond my reflection. Patient, watchful, waiting for its moment to step through.